The air was thick with tension, a palpable mix of despair and hope, fear and determination. Across the vast expanse of Russia, from the snow-laden streets of Petrograd to the remote villages scattered along the Volga, whispers of change swirled like the icy wind. It was the year 1917, a year that would forever alter the trajectory of one of the world's largest empires. History had often been kind to empires, allowing them to expand, consolidate, and endure across centuries. Yet Russia, with all its riches and contradictions, teetered on the edge of a profound transformation, a revolution that would not only dismantle centuries of autocratic rule, but would also ignite debates, conflicts, and experiments that reverberate even into our modern era. Hello and welcome to The Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The Russian Empire in 1917 was a land of stark contrasts. On one hand, it boasted immense natural resources, vast agricultural lands, and a proud tradition of culture and intellectual achievement. On the other hand, it struggled with a rigid social hierarchy, widespread poverty, and an autocracy that was increasingly out of touch with the needs and desires of its people. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was a figure both revered and resented, a man burdened with divine responsibility, yet ill-equipped to navigate the rapidly changing currents of his time. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 3 centuries, faced a society strained by industrialization, war, and social unrest. Industrial growth in Russia had accelerated in the decades preceding the revolution, leading to urban migration, the rise of a working class, and new political consciousness. Factories in Petrograd, Moscow, and other urban centers became the crucibles of modern discontent. Workers endured long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. They were organized into unions, strikes were becoming frequent, and socialist ideas circulated widely among the laboring masses. Meanwhile, the peasantry, comprising the vast majority of Russia's population, lived in rural squalor, tied to the land by outdated communal structures and burdened by taxes and rents. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 and the Bloody Sunday Massacre of 1905 had already exposed the vulnerabilities of the Tsarist regime. Nicholas II had survived challenges then, issuing the October Manifesto, which granted limited civil liberties and created the Duma, a legislative body intended to placate growing demands for reform. Yet these reforms were superficial at best, constrained by the Tsar's persistent desire to maintain autocratic control. By 1917, the pressures of World War I would test this fragile system to its breaking point. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Russia entered with a sense of patriotic fervor. The empire's armies, vast and numerous, mobilized against the Central Powers. Yet the realities of modern warfare quickly revealed systemic deficiencies. Russia's military suffered from inadequate supplies, poor leadership, and logistical challenges across immense distances. Soldiers endured appalling conditions on the front lines, facing both the brutality of combat and the neglect of a government unable to meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, back home, civilians contended with food shortages, inflation, and the constant anxiety of wartime loss. The economic strain of the war exposed the deep flaws in Russia's infrastructure. Petrograd, the capital, became a focal point of unrest. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and the city's working women, who formed a significant portion of the industrial labor force, were particularly vocal in their dissatisfaction. They were the first to strike in February 1917, demanding bread and fair wages, their protests quickly gaining momentum and drawing in workers from factories across the city. Soldiers stationed in the city, initially ordered to suppress the demonstrations, found themselves conflicted. Many were themselves poorly fed, poorly clothed, and increasingly sympathetic to the protesters. This convergence of urban discontent, worker strikes, and military hesitation created a volatile environment. In Petrograd, Tsar's authority began to crumble with alarming speed. The Duma, previously limited in its powers, took an increasingly active role, forming a provisional committee to manage the escalating crisis. Nicholas, attempting to maintain control, considered military solutions, yet by the time he decided to act, the situation had moved beyond conventional authority. His departure from Petrograd to the front in March 1917 left a vacuum that the Duma and revolutionary committees began to fill. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated the throne, ending centuries of Romanov rule and the era of Russian monarchy. The abdication was not a moment of triumphant revolution, but a concession to inevitability, an acknowledgement that the forces unleashed by war, industrialization, and social change could not be contained. A provisional government, composed largely of former Duma members and moderate reformers, assumed control. It pledged to continue the war effort, implement social reforms, and eventually pave the way for democratic governance. Yet the provisional government faced immediate challenges. One of the most significant sources of opposition came from the Petrograd Soviet, a council representing workers and soldiers. The Soviets, influenced by socialist ideologies and radical thinkers, advocated for more immediate and profound changes than the provisional government was willing or able to implement. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, positioned themselves as the vanguard of the working class, promising peace, land, and bread to a population exhausted by war and economic hardship. Lenin's April theses articulated a radical agenda: withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land to the peasants, and the transfer of political power to the Soviets. The months following the February Revolution were marked by dual power. The provisional government held official authority, while the Soviets wielded real influence on the ground. This tension created a politically unstable environment, one in which each decision could provoke unrest or rebellion. The provisional government's insistence on continuing participation in World War I eroded its legitimacy. Russian soldiers, weary and demoralized, increasingly deserted, and the front lines became unreliable. Meanwhile, food shortages worsened, inflation soared, and the urban poor faced conditions that seemed increasingly tolerable. By the summer of 1917, the Bolsheviks had gained significant traction, particularly among soldiers and workers. Lenin, who had returned from exile in April with German assistance, was a charismatic and shrewd strategist. He capitalized on popular discontent, framing the provisional government as ineffective and detached from the needs of ordinary people. The July Days, a series of spontaneous armed demonstrations in Petrograd, illustrated both the volatility of the streets and the growing strength of the Bolsheviks. Though initially suppressed, these uprisings revealed the depth of revolutionary sentiment and the potential for radical change. The provisional government attempted to consolidate power by appointing Alexander Kerensky as its head, a move intended to placate both liberals and moderate socialists. Kerensky, a compelling orator and reform-minded politician, faced impossible odds. He sought to continue the war effort while implementing land reforms and preserving civil liberties, yet these efforts were continually undermined by growing Bolshevik influence, nationalist unrest, and the realities of an empire fractured by social, ethnic, and economic divisions. The Bolshevik strategy relied on both ideological appeal and tactical precision. They understood the importance of controlling key urban centers, particularly Petrograd and Moscow. Their cadre of professional revolutionaries worked to infiltrate Soviets, factories, and military units. Lenin, along with figures such as Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin, emphasized disciplined organization, propaganda, and the cultivation of popular support. By October 1917, conditions were ripe for a decisive action. The provisional government was increasingly isolated, both politically and geographically. Railways and communications were disrupted, food shortages were acute, and the morale of troops and workers alike was low. The Bolsheviks, with the support of the Petrograd Soviet and loyal military units, staged an armed insurrection, what would come to be known as the October Revolution. The seizure of power was remarkably swift. Strategic locations, such as telegraph offices, government buildings, and bridges, were captured with minimal bloodshed. The Winter Palace, the symbolic seat of the provisional government, fell to the revolutionary forces after brief resistance. Kerensky fled, and the Bolsheviks declared control, establishing a government led by the Soviets and under the direct influence of Lenin and his party. The slogan "All Power to the Soviets" encapsulated the radical vision of governance that would define the coming years. The aftermath of the revolution was chaotic and transformative.
Russia, plunged into civil war, saw conflict between the Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, and a diverse coalition of opponents, including monarchists, liberals, and socialist factions, collectively known as the Whites. Foreign powers, fearing the spread of communism, intervened in support of anti-Bolshevik forces. The Civil War devastated the population, with famine, disease, and violence exacting a heavy toll. Yet the Bolsheviks, through a combination of military strategy, ideological discipline, and control of key urban centers, eventually secured dominance by 1922. The Russian Revolution was not merely a transfer of power from one government to another. It represented a profound restructuring of society, economy, and politics. Land reforms redistributed estates to peasants, industries were nationalized, and a planned economy emerged. The revolution also sparked a global dialogue about the nature of governance, class struggle, and the possibilities of socialism. Countries around the world observed the Russian experiment with both admiration and apprehension, and
As the Bolsheviks consolidated power, the world watched with bated breath. What would this new government, born from a revolutionary upheaval, look like in practice? Lenin, now at the helm of a country that had undergone one of the most radical political shifts in history, was tasked with building a new society from the rubble of the old. The promises of the revolution, to end the war, to redistribute land, and to create a government truly representative of the working class, were just the beginning. The challenge now was to turn these ideals into tangible realities, and the path ahead was anything but smooth. In the months following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks set about implementing their vision, but the road was fraught with resistance both from within and without. Domestically, opposition came from multiple quarters, including rival socialist factions, anarchists, and the remnants of the old aristocratic and capitalist elites. Internationally, Russia faced a hostile world as foreign powers, fearing the spread of communism, launched interventions in support of anti-Bolshevik forces. The stage was set for a brutal and prolonged civil war, one that would determine the future of the revolution and the fate of the Bolshevik government. The Civil War, which raged from 1917 to 1922, was marked by a complex and shifting set of alliances. The Bolsheviks, or Reds, faced off against the Whites, a coalition of monarchists, liberals, and other anti-Bolshevik forces. The war was not only a military struggle, but also an ideological battle, with the Reds fighting to establish a socialist state and the Whites seeking to restore the old order. The conflict was brutal, and both sides employed horrific tactics to crush their enemies. The Bolsheviks, in particular, did not shy away from using terror as a tool of governance, establishing the Cheka, a secret police force tasked with rooting out counter-revolutionaries and quelling dissent. In the midst of this chaos, Lenin's leadership was put to the test. He moved quickly to solidify Bolshevik control over key urban centers, nationalize industries, and redistribute land to the peasants. His government implemented sweeping reforms, including the nationalization of banks and the seizure of private property. The Bolsheviks also made peace with Germany in 1918, ending Russia's involvement in World War I through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This decision was highly controversial, particularly among those who had hoped for a more egalitarian internationalist approach. However, Lenin argued that peace with Germany was necessary to consolidate power at home and focus on the fight against internal enemies. As the Civil War intensified, the Bolsheviks faced growing challenges. The economy was in tatters, the country was beset by famine, and dissent was spreading. Many peasants who had initially supported the revolution grew disillusioned with the Bolshevik leadership, especially after the government began requisitioning. As the Bolsheviks consolidated power, the world watched with bated breath. What would this new government, born from a revolutionary upheaval, look like in practice? Lenin, now at the helm of a country that had undergone one of the most radical political shifts in history, was tasked with building a new society from the rubble of the old. The promises of the revolution, to end the war, to redistribute land, and to create a government truly representative of the working class, were just the beginning. The challenge now was to turn these ideals into tangible realities, and the path ahead was anything but smooth. In the months following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks set about implementing their vision, but the road was fraught with resistance, both from within and without. Domestically, opposition came from multiple quarters, including rival socialist factions, anarchists, and the remnants of the old aristocratic and capitalist elites. Internationally, Russia faced a hostile world as foreign powers, fearing the spread of communism, launched interventions in support of anti-Bolshevik forces. The stage was set for a brutal and prolonged civil war, one that would determine the future of the revolution and the fate of the Bolshevik government. The Civil War, which raged from 1917 to 1922, was marked by a complex and shifting set of alliances. The Bolsheviks, or Reds, faced off against the Whites, a coalition of monarchists, liberals, and other anti-Bolshevik forces. The war was not only a military struggle, but also an ideological battle, with the Reds fighting to establish a socialist state and the Whites seeking to restore the old order. The conflict was brutal, and both sides employed horrific tactics to crush their enemies. The Bolsheviks, in particular, did not shy away from using terror as a tool of governance, establishing the Cheka, a secret police force tasked with rooting out counter-revolutionaries and quelling dissent. In the midst of this chaos, Lenin's leadership was put to the test. He moved quickly to solidify Bolshevik control over key urban centers, nationalize industries, and redistribute land to the peasants. His government implemented sweeping reforms, including the nationalization of banks and the seizure of private property. The Bolsheviks also made peace with Germany in 1918, ending Russia's involvement in World War I through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This decision was highly controversial, particularly among those who had hoped for a more egalitarian internationalist approach. However, Lenin argued that peace with Germany was necessary to consolidate power at home and focus on the fight against internal enemies. As the Civil War intensified, the Bolsheviks faced growing challenges. The economy was in tatters, the country was beset by famine, and dissent was spreading. Many peasants who had initially supported the revolution grew disillusioned with the Bolshevik leadership, especially after the government began requisitioning grain to supply the cities and the army. The war communism policies, which included the forced collectivization of agriculture and the centralization of industry, were deeply unpopular and exacerbated food shortages. In response, the Bolsheviks cracked down on dissent, instituting harsh measures to suppress resistance. Despite these challenges, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious in the Civil War, largely due to their ability to maintain centralized control, their use of terror, and their ability to tap into the support of workers and soldiers. The Whites, though initially supported by foreign powers, were divided and lacked the cohesive leadership that the Bolsheviks had under Lenin. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had effectively won the Civil War, and the Soviet Union was officially established. The victory of the Bolsheviks did not mark the end of the revolution, however. Lenin, now in control of a war-torn and impoverished country, faced the monumental task of rebuilding the economy and stabilizing the political system. His response to the economic crisis was the introduction of the New Economic Policy, NEP, in 1921. The NEP allowed for a limited return to market economics, with small businesses and some agricultural production being returned to private ownership. This policy was a pragmatic decision aimed at restoring production and alleviating some of the harshest conditions brought about by war communism. The NEP was a temporary retreat from the Bolshevik vision of total state control, but it was necessary for the survival of the regime. Lenin's death in 1924 marked the end of an era for the Soviet Union. He had led the revolution to its victorious conclusion and established the foundations of the Soviet state, but his health had been in decline for several years. After his death, a power struggle erupted within the Communist Party, with figures like Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin vying for leadership. Trotsky, a brilliant military strategist and one of the key figures in the revolution, was initially seen as the likely successor. However, Stalin, who had quietly consolidated power within the party apparatus, eventually outmaneuvered Trotsky and became the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rise to power marked the beginning of a new phase in Soviet history. While Lenin had envisioned a more democratic socialist state, Stalin moved decisively towards a totalitarian regime. His rule would be marked by intense repression, purges of perceived enemies, and a drive for rapid industrialization that would transform the Soviet Union into a global superpower. Stalin's policies would shape the Soviet Union for decades, creating a legacy that was both transformative and deeply controversial. The Russian Revolution of 1917, then, was not a single event, but a complex and multifaceted process that unfolded over many years. It was a revolution that radically changed the course of Russian history, bringing an end to the Tsarist autocracy and establishing the world's first socialist state. But the revolution also laid the groundwork for a new set of challenges, both for Russia and the world. The Bolshevik vision of a classless, stateless society would be tested in ways that its founders could not have anticipated, and the legacy of the revolution would continue to shape global politics for much of the 20th century. In the end, the Russian Revolution was a story of ambition and tragedy, of idealism and authoritarianism, of hope and fear. It was a revolution that transformed Russia and the world for better or worse, and its effects are still felt today. The ideas born in 1917 continue to resonate, sparking debates about power, inequality, and the role of the state in shaping the lives of its citizens. The world beyond Russia watched the unfolding of these events with a mixture of awe, apprehension, and curiosity. In Europe and North America, the idea that a socialist government could seize power in one of the world's great empires seemed almost inconceivable. Yet, the Russian Revolution of 1917 was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of decades of social, political, and economic pressures that had reached a tipping point. The collapse of the monarchy, the rise of mass political movements, and the audacious strategy of the Bolsheviks illustrated the power of organized, ideologically driven action in shaping history. Within Russia, the immediate post-revolution years were marked by attempts to consolidate revolutionary gains while managing the chaos left in the wake of war and civil strife. Lenin and his Bolsheviks faced a dual challenge, implementing socialist policies that would fulfill revolutionary promises while simultaneously ensuring that their authority remained uncontested. The establishment of the Cheka, the secret police, became a central instrument of control. This organization sought to identify and neutralize counter-revolutionaries, often resorting to brutal methods. Fear and propaganda became essential tools of governance, a reality that shaped the political culture of the Soviet state from its earliest days. One of the most dramatic social transformations of the period was the redistribution of land. For centuries, Russian peasants had lived under the shadow of feudal obligations, tied to estates owned by nobles who enjoyed privileges denied to the majority of the population. The Bolsheviks promised to overturn this hierarchy, transferring land from the aristocracy to the peasantry. While the promise resonated widely and won significant support among rural populations, implementation was uneven. Local committees often seized estates on their own initiative, sometimes clashing with central authorities. The process revealed the complexities inherent in translating revolutionary ideology into practical policy. Economic reconstruction was equally challenging. War communism, instituted during the Civil War, had prioritized state control over all aspects of production and distribution, often at the expense of efficiency and popular support. Factories were nationalized, and requisitioning of grain from peasants became standard practice to supply urban centers and the army. While these measures were intended to sustain the revolutionary effort, they caused significant hardship, sparking unrest in both cities and countryside. By 1921, the situation had reached a critical point. The Kronstadt Rebellion, led by sailors who had once been staunch supporters of the revolution, highlighted widespread discontent. Lenin responded pragmatically, introducing the new economic policy, which reintroduced elements of market economics and allowed limited private enterprise. The NEP stabilized the economy to some extent and allowed the Bolsheviks to consolidate political power. Small businesses reopened, and peasants could sell surplus produce in markets. Industrial production gradually increased, though the economy remained fragile.
The NEP also reflected Lenin's flexibility as a leader. He recognized that ideological purity alone could not sustain the nascent Soviet state. This pragmatism, however, was temporary. The vision of a fully socialist society remained the ultimate goal, and the concessions of the NEP were always understood as a means to an end. In the realm of politics, the Bolsheviks moved to consolidate one-party rule. Political pluralism, tolerated during the early revolutionary period, was increasingly curtailed. Opposition parties were banned or suppressed, and dissenting voices within the Communist Party itself were marginalized. This centralization of power ensured stability for the Bolsheviks, but also laid the foundation for authoritarian governance. Lenin, aware of both internal and external threats, believed that a tightly controlled party apparatus was essential to defend the revolution against enemies and sabotage. The cultural and intellectual life of Russia was also profoundly affected. Revolutionary ideology permeated literature, art, and education. Artists and writers were encouraged to produce work that aligned with socialist ideals, celebrating the achievements of the working class and promoting the values of the new society. Avant-garde movements thrived temporarily as the revolution opened spaces for experimentation and innovation. Yet, as political control tightened, cultural expression became increasingly subordinated to state priorities, a pattern that would continue throughout Soviet history. Internationally, the Russian Revolution inspired both hope and fear. Socialist and communist movements around the world looked to Russia as a model and a symbol of possibility. In Germany, Hungary, and other countries, revolutionary uprisings erupted, fueled by the example of the Bolsheviks. Yet these movements often lacked the organization, popular support, or strategic leadership that had enabled Lenin and his allies to succeed. For governments and elites in Europe and North America, the Bolshevik victory was a warning, prompting fears of a global spread of revolution. These fears contributed to diplomatic isolation and interventions in the Russian Civil War, reflecting the broader geopolitical consequences of the events of 1917. By the mid-1920s, the Soviet Union was emerging as a state defined by both revolutionary ideals and pragmatic governance. The administrative structures of government, the reorganization of the economy under NEP policies, and the consolidation of Bolshevik authority created a framework that would endure for decades. The revolution had fundamentally altered the relationship between the state and its citizens, introducing new concepts of rights, responsibilities, and social obligations, even as it imposed limits on political freedoms. The human toll of the revolution and subsequent civil war was staggering. Millions perished from combat, disease, and famine. Families were torn apart, communities destroyed, and entire regions depopulated. The trauma of these years left deep scars on the Russian psyche, shaping collective memory, influencing literature, art, and political discourse for generations. Stories of heroism, sacrifice, and resilience coexist with accounts of suffering, repression, and betrayal, reflecting the complexity and contradictions inherent in revolutionary change. Education and literacy became central priorities for the Soviet government. The revolution was not only political, but also deeply cultural and ideological. Literacy campaigns, educational reforms, and the promotion of socialist values aimed to create a citizenry capable of participating in the new society. This emphasis on education transformed Russian society, expanding access to knowledge and creating new opportunities for social mobility. It also served the political purpose of inculcating loyalty to the Soviet state and fostering an understanding of Marxist-Leninist principles. The revolution also reshaped gender relations. Women who had been active participants in strikes and demonstrations were recognized as important agents of change. The Bolsheviks implemented policies to improve women's rights, including access to education, employment, and legal equality. Efforts to expand social services such as childcare and healthcare reflected a broader commitment to transform social structures. However, the realities of post-revolutionary Russia, marked by economic hardship and social upheaval, meant that progress was uneven and often contested. The formation of the Soviet Union in 1922 represented the culmination of the revolutionary process. It unified diverse territories and peoples under a centralized socialist government. The creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics formalized the new political order, providing a structure for governance that balanced regional autonomy with centralized control. the Soviet Union was in many ways an experiment in state-building, seeking to apply Marxist principles to a vast and diverse empire. Its successes and failures would provide lessons and warnings for both supporters and critics of socialism worldwide. The legacy of the Russian Revolution extends far beyond the borders of Russia. It reshaped global politics, inspired revolutionary movements, and challenged assumptions about the inevitability of capitalist democracy. The ideological battles of the 20th century, including the Cold War, can be traced in part to the upheavals of 1917. The revolution demonstrated the capacity of ideas, when combined with organization and opportunity, to transform society in profound and lasting ways. Yet, the revolution was not a monolith. It was experienced differently by various social groups. For workers and peasants, it promised relief from oppression and greater control over their lives. For intellectuals and artists, it offered both opportunities and constraints, opening spaces for experimentation while imposing ideological boundaries. For the elite, it meant dispossession and, in many cases, exile or death. The revolution reshaped social hierarchies, creating new opportunities and challenges and forcing individuals and communities to navigate a rapidly changing world. As we reflect on the Russian Revolution, it is clear that it was both a product of its time and a catalyst for future change. Economic crises, social inequality, and political rigidity created the conditions for upheaval, while the vision, strategy, and leadership of the Bolsheviks enabled the seizure of power. The revolution reminds us that historical change is contingent, shaped by choices, circumstances, and human agency. It is a story of ambition, courage, tragedy, and resilience, a moment when the aspirations of millions converge to reshape a nation and ultimately the world.
By the late 1920s, the Soviet Union was entering a period of profound transformation. The death of Lenin in 1924 had left a leadership vacuum that Joseph Stalin quickly filled, using his position as General Secretary to consolidate power and eliminate rivals. Leon Trotsky, who had been a prominent revolutionary leader and architect of the Red Army, was increasingly marginalized. By 1927, Trotsky had been expelled from the Communist Party, and in 1929, he was exiled from the Soviet Union entirely. Stalin's ascendancy marked a new chapter in the revolutionary story, the consolidation of a single-party authoritarian state that would pursue rapid industrialization and social engineering on an unprecedented scale. Stalin's vision of the Soviet Union was ambitious and ruthless. He believed that the survival of the socialist state depended on the transformation of the economy and society at a speed that could outpace potential internal and external threats. The 5-year plans, initiated in 1928, set extraordinarily high targets for industrial production, particularly in heavy industries such as steel, coal, and machinery. These plans were central to Stalin's strategy of catching up with the industrialized nations of the West, and they reflected a belief that economic strength was inseparable from political security. The goals of rapid industrialization were pursued with extraordinary rigor, often at tremendous human cost. Collectivization of agriculture was another cornerstone of Stalin's policies. Peasants were forced to join collective farms, surrendering their land, livestock, and equipment to the state. Resistance was met with harsh repression, including deportations, executions, and the confiscation of food. The policy aimed not only to increase agricultural productivity, but also to break the traditional power of the peasantry, whom the state viewed as a potential source of opposition. The consequences were catastrophic. Famine swept across large regions of the Soviet Union, particularly in Ukraine, where millions perished. Collectivization fundamentally altered rural life, eradicating centuries-old village structures and reshaping social and economic relationships. The consolidation of political power under Stalin also entailed the systematic elimination of perceived enemies within the Communist Party and the broader society. The Great Purge of the late 1930s targeted party officials, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens suspected of disloyalty or counter-revolutionary tendencies. The purges were often justified in the name of protecting the revolution, but they created an atmosphere of fear and compliance, effectively silencing dissent. The combination of industrial ambition, agricultural control, and political repression created a state in which authority was centralized and loyalty was enforced through both ideology and coercion.
Despite the human toll, these policies did transform the Soviet Union into a formidable industrial power. By the late 1930s, cities were growing, factories were producing modern machinery, and the military had been rebuilt on a scale that would soon influence the outcome of global conflict. The Soviet state became a complex, highly organized system, capable of mobilizing resources, enforcing policies, and maintaining internal security. The legacy of the revolution was now inseparable from the machinery of state power, which had grown far beyond the initial aspirations of Lenin or the early Bolsheviks. The revolution's impact on culture and society was equally profound. Education and literacy campaigns expanded, producing a population better equipped for participation in the industrial and political life of the nation. Soviet propaganda, in the form of posters, films, literature, and theater, reinforced the ideals of the revolution and glorified the achievements of the state. Socialist realism became the dominant artistic style, emphasizing themes of labor, heroism, and loyalty to the collective. Religion, once a central feature of Russian life, was suppressed, as the state promoted atheism and sought to replace traditional beliefs with revolutionary ideology. Women, too, experienced significant changes. The revolution and subsequent policies opened new opportunities for employment, education, and participation in public life. The state promoted gender equality in theory, emphasizing the role of women in both the workforce and the socialist project. Yet the realities of daily life were complex. Many women faced double burdens, balancing industrial labor with domestic responsibilities, while social services often struggled to meet the demands of a rapidly changing society. Nonetheless, the transformation of gender roles represented a major social shift, challenging traditional hierarchies and norms. The international dimension of the Russian Revolution and its aftermath cannot be overstated. The establishment of the Soviet Union inspired socialist movements and revolutionary parties around the world. The Comintern, or Communist International, was founded in 1919 to promote global revolution, supporting uprisings in countries as diverse as Germany, China, and Spain. While many of these efforts failed, the influence of the Russian model was profound, shaping political discourse and strategy in multiple continents. At the same time, Western governments, alarmed by the prospect of communist expansion, adopted policies of containment and intervention, further embedding the Soviet Union in a complex global struggle. The ideological significance of the revolution was matched by its strategic implications. The Soviet Union emerged as a unique state, combining elements of modern industrial governance with revolutionary ideology. Its centralized planning and command economy contrasted sharply with capitalist models, creating a system capable of rapid mobilization but vulnerable to inefficiencies and rigidity. The Soviet model influenced international debates about economic development, social justice, and governance, leaving a lasting imprint on both theory and practice. Within Russia, the revolution had altered the very fabric of society. Class structures were redefined, with the old aristocracy largely eliminated or displaced, and the working class and peasantry elevated in status, at least rhetorically. Social mobility increased for those aligned with the state, though access to power was tightly controlled by party membership and loyalty. The relationship between the individual and the state shifted dramatically, with collective interests emphasized over personal freedoms, a theme that would persist throughout Soviet history. Education, science, and technology became tools of both social engineering and national development. The state invested heavily in technical education to produce engineers, scientists, and skilled workers who could support industrial growth. Literacy campaigns and mass education initiatives aimed to create a politically conscious and technically competent populace. The Soviet emphasis on education reflected both practical needs and ideological commitments, intertwining development with the cultivation of social values. Religion and culture were actively reshaped by revolutionary policies. The Russian Orthodox Church, once a pillar of social life and Tsarist legitimacy, faced suppression, with clergy persecuted and properties confiscated. Alternative cultural forms, including literature, theater, and visual arts, were encouraged when aligned with socialist goals, promoting narratives of labor, sacrifice, and revolutionary heroism. These cultural initiatives helped to legitimize the state and inculcate a sense of shared purpose, even as they curtailed diversity of thought and expression. As the Soviet Union evolved, it also grappled with ethnic and regional diversity. The empire's vast territories encompassed numerous nationalities, languages, and cultures, each with its own traditions and identities. The Bolsheviks sought to integrate these diverse groups into the socialist framework, establishing republics and autonomous regions, promoting local languages and cultures in some cases, while enforcing centralized control and ideological conformity in others. The tension between local autonomy and centralized authority remained a persistent feature of Soviet governance. The economic policies of the 1920s and 1930s laid the foundation for the Soviet Union's later role as a global power. Industrialization and collectivization, despite their human cost, transformed the country from a primarily agrarian society into an industrialized state, capable of competing with major Western powers. The revolution had set in motion forces that reshaped production, labor relations, and technological development, creating the conditions for the Soviet Union to play a decisive role in global affairs, particularly during World War II and the subsequent Cold War era. The Russian Revolution of 1917, therefore, was not simply an event. It was a transformative process that redefined political, social, and economic life. It challenged existing hierarchies, reshaped power structures, and inspired generations of activists and thinkers worldwide. The revolution was both a product of its historical moment and a catalyst for future change, demonstrating the complex interplay of ideas, material conditions, and human agency in shaping history. The lessons of 1917 resonate even today. The revolution illustrates the potential for collective action to achieve profound change, but it also highlights the dangers of centralized power, ideological rigidity, and the suppression of dissent. It forces us to grapple with questions of justice, equality, and governance, and it challenges us to consider how societies respond to crises, whether through reform, revolution, or repression. The Russian Revolution reminds us that history is never determined. It is the outcome of choices, struggles, and the unpredictable dynamics of human life.
As the 1930s progressed, the world's perception of the Soviet Union evolved. Once seen primarily as a revolutionary experiment, the USSR became a symbol of the potential and peril of radical social transformation. Governments across Europe and the Americas studied its policies, debated its successes and failures, and responded with a mixture of admiration, fear, and skepticism. The ideological influence of the revolution extended far beyond Russia's borders, inspiring political movements, intellectual debates, and artistic endeavors that sought to grapple with the promise of equality and the realities of authoritarian control. Within the Soviet Union, the revolution's achievements and contradictions became deeply intertwined. The centralization of power, the implementation of state-controlled economic plans, and the promotion of socialist ideology created a society that was remarkably cohesive in some respects, yet fragile in others. Stalin's leadership ensured that the revolutionary state survived internal dissent and external threats, but it also entrenched a culture of surveillance, repression, and fear. Ordinary citizens had to navigate a world in which loyalty was continuously monitored and even minor deviations could have grave consequences. The revolution, for all its promise, demanded both sacrifice and conformity. Education, science, and technological development continued to be central pillars of Soviet policy. Massive literacy campaigns and the expansion of technical education reflected a dual purpose: to cultivate a population capable of supporting industrial growth and to instill socialist values from a young age. By emphasizing education as a revolutionary tool, the Soviet state sought to create a citizenry that was both technically skilled and ideologically aligned, reflecting the belief that human development was inseparable from social and political transformation. Universities, research institutions, and vocational schools became centers of state planning, producing generations of professionals who would sustain and advance the Soviet project. The cultural landscape of the USSR remained tightly controlled yet vibrant in certain domains. Literature, theater, and visual arts were expected to reflect socialist ideals, portraying the triumph of the working class, the heroism of labor, and the inevitability of historical progress. Socialist realism became the dominant mode, emphasizing narratives that celebrated the state and its achievements. Within these constraints, artists and writers found ways to innovate, experiment, and sometimes subtly critique the system, navigating the fine line between creativity and ideological conformity. The revolution had fundamentally reshaped not only political and economic structures, but also the very ways in which people thought, imagined, and expressed themselves. Women continued to experience profound changes as a result of the revolution and its aftermath. Policies promoting gender equality, access to education, and participation in the workforce expanded opportunities, even as societal expectations remained complex and demanding. Women often faced dual burdens, balancing professional responsibilities with domestic duties, yet the revolution opened spaces for agency, visibility, and influence. Women's participation in both political and economic life became a hallmark of the new society, symbolizing the broader social transformations set in motion in 1917. The Soviet state also grappled with the diverse ethnic and cultural composition of its vast territories. While nominally promoting national self-determination, the centralized authority often enforced conformity, creating tensions between regional autonomy and centralized control. National republics were established, languages promoted, and local traditions incorporated into socialist narratives. Yet these concessions coexisted with a strong emphasis on loyalty to the central government. The balancing act between diversity and unity highlighted the complexities of governing a multi-ethnic, geographically vast empire, a challenge that had persisted since the days of the Tsars and now assumed new forms under revolutionary rule. The international ramifications of the Russian Revolution continued to unfold throughout the 20th century. The Soviet model influenced anti-colonial movements, socialist parties, and labor unions worldwide. Revolutionary thought inspired both radical and moderate reformers, shaping political agendas and strategies in countries as diverse as China, Vietnam, Cuba, and parts of Africa and the Middle East. The ideological divide created by the revolution eventually contributed to the global polarization of the Cold War, defining international relations for decades. The Russian Revolution demonstrated that transformative ideas could ripple across borders, affecting not only domestic politics, but the global order itself. Domestically, the revolution's legacy was complex and often contradictory. Economic modernization, social reform, and industrial growth coexisted with repression, purges, and human suffering. The promises of equality and social justice were pursued alongside coercive policies that prioritized state objectives over individual rights. Yet despite these contradictions, the Soviet Union endured, and the structures established by the revolution enabled it to survive challenges both internal and external. The revolution had created a state apparatus capable of mobilizing resources, enforcing policies, and shaping the lives of millions, a testament to both human ingenuity and the dangers of concentrated power. The memory of the revolution remained vivid in Russian society. For supporters, it symbolized the triumph of the oppressed, the empowerment of the working class, and the possibility of a society organized around collective ideals. For detractors, it represented tyranny, the suppression of individual freedoms, and the human cost of ideological ambition. These competing narratives shaped political discourse, education, literature, and historical scholarship, reflecting the enduring significance of 1917 in the Russian consciousness. The revolution was not merely an event in the past, it was a living presence, influencing the decisions, aspirations, and fears of successive generations. World War II further tested the Soviet state born from revolution. The USSR faced the existential threat posed by Nazi Germany, and the industrial and military foundations established under Stalin proved decisive. The sacrifices and mobilization of the Soviet people, rooted in a society transformed by revolution, enabled the nation to endure and ultimately contribute to the defeat of Hitler's forces. The war validated, to some extent, the centralized planning and organizational capacity developed since 1917, while also exposing the immense human cost of these policies. The lessons of the revolution were writ large on the battlefield, demonstrating both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the Soviet system. In the decades that followed, the Russian Revolution continued to shape global politics, economics, and culture.
The Cold War was in many ways a continuation of the ideological struggle inaugurated in 1917, pitting capitalist democracies against a socialist state determined to expand its influence and defend its revolutionary legacy. The ideological debates that emerged from the revolution informed theories of development, governance, and social justice, influencing policymakers, academics, and activists worldwide. The revolution's impact was not confined to borders. It had become a global phenomenon, affecting the trajectory of nations and the course of history. Reflecting on the Russian Revolution also requires an understanding of its human dimensions. Millions experienced profound changes in their daily lives. Workers gained influence in factories, peasants acquired land, families endured famine, and citizens navigated an environment of political uncertainty and social transformation. The revolution reshaped expectations, aspirations, and possibilities, creating opportunities and imposing constraints in equal measure. It was a reminder that history is not solely the domain of leaders or armies, but also the lived experience of ordinary people, whose actions, decisions, and endurance shape the course of events. The revolution also prompted profound debates about morality, ethics, and the balance between ideals and reality. Leaders faced difficult choices: how to sustain a revolution in the face of internal opposition, how to balance social justice with economic necessity, and how to defend a state against external threats without succumbing to tyranny. These dilemmas continue to resonate, offering lessons about the challenges inherent in social transformation and the costs of pursuing ambitious political visions. The Russian Revolution of 1917, viewed from the perspective of history, is a testament to the power of human agency and collective action. It illustrates how deep structural inequalities, social pressures, and political miscalculations can converge to create extraordinary historical moments. The fall of the Tsarist regime, the rise of the Bolsheviks, and the subsequent establishment of the Soviet Union demonstrate that revolutions are complex, multifaceted phenomena that defy simple explanations or interpretations. They are at once political, social, economic, and cultural, encompassing the aspirations and fears of millions. Even today, the reverberations of the revolution can be felt. Modern Russia, the post-Soviet states, and the global left continue to grapple with the legacy of 1917. Debates over governance, equality, human rights, and economic policy are informed by the experiences of the revolution and its aftermath. Scholars, writers, and policymakers continue to study the period, seeking to understand both its successes and failures and to draw lessons applicable to contemporary challenges. The revolution remains a mirror,